On the morning of April 14, 1940-3, at the Kummersdorf proving ground 20 miles south of Berlin, a German engineer named Warner stood at the edge of a concrete apron, staring at something that should not have been there. It was an American tank, an M4 Sherman, serial number USA 067641, with cast Holland 70-5mm gun, olive drab paint still showing the desert dust of North Africa. Someone had chalked armor thickness measurements on every surface: front, sides, turret, mantle T, each number followed by the angle of the plate. The Germans had been thorough. They always were. But the numbers were not what stopped him. He climbed up onto the hull, the metal cold under his palms, and lowered himself to the ground. He was in a state of shock. He climbed back up, lowered himself through the commander's hatch, feet finding the turret basket floor. And for a moment, he just stood there in the fighting compartment, looking around. And that is when something changed. Not in the tank. In him. What this engineer saw inside the turret would quietly unravel everything the German armored corps believed about the enemy they were fighting. Not about American courage, not about American numbers, about something far more dangerous than either. This is that story. The Sherman sitting on the concrete at Kummersdorf had a name. The Americans had painted it on the hull in white block letters. Ward Addy II. It belonged to Company G, 1st Armored Regiment, 1st Armored Division of the United States Army. 8 weeks earlier, it had been fighting in Tunisia. To understand what the tank was doing in Germany, you need to understand how it got there. February 14th, 1940-3, K.I. Sereni Pass. The 1st Armored Division of the United States Army was devastated in the Tunisian desert. The German 10th and 20-1st Panzer Divisions had set a trap. When the Sherman tanks rolled into the pass in column, 80-8mm flak guns firing armor-piercing rounds tore apart the entire C Company. 40- for Shermans were destroyed that day. The 1st Armored Division lost nearly half its tanks, but Ward Addy II was not hit. It drove through the crossfire, weaving between burning comrades. It covered 350 kilometers of desert under shell fire without a single breakdown. 350 kilometers of Tunisian road without a single mechanical failure. But it was finally captured by the Germans, not because of battle damage, but because it ran out of fuel. It was loaded onto a train and shipped across the Mediterranean back to Germany. The Germans dragged it to Kummersdorf not for display, but for dissection. They wanted to understand what kind of machine the Americans had built. The moment Warner climbed into the turret, the first thing he noticed was not the weapon, not the armor, but something he had never felt in any tank before: space. The Sherman's fighting compartment was far roomier than German tanks. The turret basket gave the commander room to move, and each of the 5 crewmen had a sensible operating position. German tanks were known for being cramped, a philosophical choice, as a smaller profile meant being harder to hit, but the price of cramped quarters was proof against the sharp decline in efficiency during prolonged combat. Warner sat in the commander's position and reached for the turret traverse mechanism. It was a hydraulic doctor system powered by an independent electric motor that could rotate the entire turret 360 degrees in 15 seconds. The gunner could make fine adjustments with a hand crank or use a power switch for fast slewing. If the commander spotted a target at 3 o'clock and the gun was pointed at 9, the gunner could be on target in under 8 seconds. Warner knew German tanks could not do this. The Panther OS-D had a turret traverse system driven by the main engine through a power takeoff. When the engine was idling, traverse was agonizingly slow. One full rotation took 60 seconds. If the engine was off, as it often was in ambush positions to conserve fuel, the crew had only a hand wheel, no power traverse at all. The later OS-A improved this, getting full rotation down to about 15 seconds at combat engine speed. But then Germany ran out of the raw materials needed for the electrical system. In the final production variant of the Panzer IV, the OS-J, they deleted the powered turret traverse entirely. The most produced German medium tank ended the war with its crew hand-cranking the turret like it was 1930-2. But the Sherman had something else the Germans had never seen in any tank. A gyroscopic stabilizer mounted alongside the traverse motor. Built by Westinghouse, it held the gun steady while the tank was moving. It did not aim the gun or replace the gunner's skill. What it did was keep the barrel from bouncing with every bump, so that when the tank stopped, the gun was already close to level. The gunner needed only a small correction, not a full ray minus aim from a wildly pitching barrel. A Sherman coming to a halt could fire an aimed round within seconds. A Panther needed the gunner to wrestle the long barrel back onto target. The difference was measured in seconds. In a tank engagement, seconds were lives. A post-war study found that the side that got the first round on target won the fight, not the side with the bigger gun or thicker armor. After action reports repeatedly noted that Sherman seemed to fire first, even when the German crew had spotted them at the same time or earlier. A Tiger commander could be in a perfect ambush position and still lose the timing advantage. If he missed, and the 80-8 missed more often than the legend suggests, the Sherman's turret was already spinning. The American gunner had the target, power traverse put him online, and the stabilizer had held his barrel close to level during the approach. He fired, and then he fired again, and again. 3 or 4 rounds in the time it took the Tiger crew to reload and aim once. This is what the Kummersdorf report meant when it noted the Sherman's fire control systems. Warner and his team continued their deep inspection. They opened the engine compartment and found a 4GI AV-8 gasoline engine, 1100 cubic inches of displacement, 450 horsepower. They recorded the specifications, then noticed something that puzzled them. Every component of this engine bore a federal stock number. Every bolt, every gasket, every hose was marked and catalogued. They removed a side armor plate and saw how the road wheels were mounted. Bolt holes aligned precisely, no filing needed, no shims, no adjustment. A road wheel from one Sherman could be installed directly on another, regardless of which factory the tank came from. This was what truly stunned the Germans. One Sherman was built by Lima Locomotive Works in Ohio, another by Pressed Steel Car Company in Pennsylvania. Two factories 600 kilometers apart, producing parts so standardized that a mechanic could swap transmissions between them. Remember that, because what the Germans were looking at was not a tank. It was a manufacturing philosophy that their entire industrial system could not replicate. In Germany, if a Panther's final doctor failed, and they failed constantly, you needed a replacement made for that specific Panther from that specific production run, often from the same factory. If the part came from a different batch, a mechanic might spend hours with files and shims making it fit. If the right part was not available, and by 1940-, for it almost never was, the tanks at and waited for a part that might never come. But the engineers at Kummersdorf were not finished. They kept opening panels. Behind the driver's seat, mounted low against the hull, they found a small gasoline engine connected to a generator, a Homelight auxiliary power unit. A single cylinder, air-cooled motor no bigger than a bread box. It ran the tank's electrical system independently of the main engine. Turret traverse, radio, interior lighting, all operational without burning main fuel or announcing the tank's position with engine noise. And then there was the heat. The exhaust from the little Homelight was ducted into the crew compartment in cold weather. American tankers in the Ardennes, in the frozen fields of Lorraine, in the December fog of the Hurtgen forest, they had heating. Not much, but some. German anchors had nothing. A Panther crew in winter sat in a steel box at whatever temperature the air decided to be. If the engine was off, the inside of the turret was a freezer. If the engine was on, it consumed fuel they could not replace and broadcast their position to every listening post within a kilometer. The engineers noted the auxiliary generator in their report. They did not editorialize. They did not need to. Because here is what was becoming clear to the men at Kummersdorf. The Americans had not built a better tank. The 70-5mm gun was adequate. not superior. The armor was acceptable, not exceptional. In a duel against a Panzer IV, the Sherman was roughly an even match. Against a Tiger, it was outgunned. But the Americans had built something the Germans could not match. A tank designed from the first bolt to be produced by the thousands, maintained by boys who had been fixing Chevrolets 6 months earlier. It kept running in conditions that would turn a Panther into an immobile pillbox. On June 6, 1940-3, War Daddy was loaded onto a flatbed and driven to a place called Hillersleben. Albert Speer was waiting. So were the men who ran every armaments factory in the Reich, and what they were about to see would force them to confront a question none of them wanted to answer. Hillersleben was an artillery-proving ground northwest of Magdeburg. 20-7 kilometers of shooting range cut through deforested flatland. This was where Germany tested what it believed was the future of war. On June 5th, the day before the conference, Albert Speer and Joseph Goebbels stood before 10,000 armaments workers at the Berliner Sportpalast and delivered speeches about the miracle of German production. Speer presented statistics. Munitions output up 600% since 1940-1. Artillery fourfold. Tank deliveries at 1,250% of baseline. The crowd interrupted with applause. The numbers were staggering. They were also a lie. Every figure was expressed as a percentage, not in absolute units, because absolute numbers would have shown that Germany's output was still a fraction of what the Americans and Soviets were producing. Speer had chosen his baseline year carefully, a period in 1940-1 when production had been at its lowest. He was comparing a recovering patient to a man in a coma and calling it a resurrection. After the speeches, Speer and the industry leaders drove through the night to Hillersleben. The next morning, War Daddy sat on the packed earth between German vehicles. A propaganda camera crew was filming, and beside the Sherman, for the first time in public, sat a vehicle that most of the men present had never seen before, a Panther. Ost-D, the very first production model. Built by MAN in Nuremberg probably in April, 40-3 metric tons, mounting the long-barreled 70-5mm K double Yokai 40-2, one of the finest tank guns of the war. Its frontal armor was 80mm, sloped at 50-5 degrees. On paper, it was everything Germany needed. The demonstration was simple. Both tanks would attempt to climb a steep, muddy slope. The Sherman went first. It churned uphill, tracks clawing at the soft loam, engine straining, and slid back. It could not make the grade. The camera crew filmed every second. Then the Panther went. 700 horsepower from the Maybach engine, wider tracks gripping the same slope. It crested. The spectators watched the Panther conquer the hill that the American tank could not. The photographs went straight into Signal magazine. The captions were triumphant. General Sherman fell back, one read. His German contender, a new heavy tank, conquered the same obstacle. That was the story Germany told itself in June of 1940-3. Now he was the story Germany did not tell. A week after the demonstration, Das Reich, one of the most widely read weekly newspapers, published an article about the captured Sherman. The tone was not what you would expect from a propaganda organ reviewing an enemy weapon. The author called the Sherman one of the special accomplishments of the North American laboratories and described it as quite a praiseworthy product of the North American steel industry. Think about that sentence. A German propaganda newspaper in wartime publicly complimenting the enemy's tank. Not its gun, not its armor, its steel industry, its laboratories, the systems behind the machine. Someone, an engineer or an editor, perhaps someone who had read the Kummersdorf report, was trying to send a signal through the noise. The Sherman did not need to climb that hill. It did not need to outgun the Panther. What it needed to do, it had already done. 350 kilometers of Tunisian road without a single breakdown, built by locomotive workers who learned tank production in months. With parts from a dozen factories that snapped together like children's blocks. And the Panther, the beautiful, powerful Panther that had just climbed the hill at Hillersleben, was about to prove exactly why that mattered. 5 weeks after Speer watched it crest that muddy slope, the Panther went to war. On July 5, 1940-3, 200 Panthers of the 50-1st and 50-2nd Panzer Battalions rolled forward at Kursk in the largest tank battle in history. Within 20-4 hours, more than half were out of action, not from Soviet guns, from mechanical failure. Fuel pumps leaked and caught fire. Transmission seized, final drive shattered under the tank's own weight. Crews abandoned vehicles and blew them up because nothing could be done to fix them without factory-level equipment that did not exist within 500 kilometers. By the end of the first week, operational readiness in some Panther units had dropped to 16%. Out of every 6 Panthers that had rolled toward the front, 5 were sitting motionless somewhere behind the lines, waiting for parts that would not come, mechanics who were not trained, and tools that did not exist. Somewhere in Germany, War Daddy sat in a shed at Kummersdorf. Its engine still ran, its transmission still shifted, every part still fit, and nobody in Berlin was talking about the hill anymore. Most people misunderstand tank combat. In the Second World War, they think it was about armor thickness and gun caliber. And those things mattered, but they were not what decided most engagements. What decided most engagements was who fired first. And this is where something the engineers found inside War Daddy stops being a technical detail and becomes a death sentence. The Americans had built something that went far beyond what sat on the proving ground at Kummersdorf. They had built a repair and supply system so fast, so standardized, so ruthlessly efficient that a Sherman knocked out on Monday could be back in the line by Wednesday, while a Panther knocked out on Monday might still be sitting in a field in April. On the 5th of June, 1940-4, the day before the largest amphibious invasion in history, a fleet of ships sat in the English Channel carrying something no army had ever attempted to deliver under fire on a hostile beach. Not tanks, spare parts. More than 50,000 individual Sherman components had been crated, catalogued, and loaded onto transport vessels. Road wheels, track links, transmission assemblies, engine blocks, turret rings, periscope heads, hydraulic lines, gyroscope units. Every part stamped with a federal stock number that matched every other part with the same number, regardless of which factory had made it. Chrysler in Detroit, Fisher Body in Grand Blanc, Lima Locomotive in Ohio, Pressed Steel Car in Pennsylvania. Behind the transports carrying the parts came something even more unusual: floating repair depots, welding equipment, machine lathes, engine hoists, all mounted on vessels that would anchor offshore and begin processing damaged vehicles within hours of the first wave hitting the sand. This was not improvisation. This was doctrine. The United States Army had designed a system they called echelons, starting at the crew level and scaling up to full factory minus grade overhaul. First echelon, the crew themselves, fixing what they could with the tools stowed in the tank. Second echelon, the company maintenance section, working in the field with slightly heavier equipment. Third echelon, battalion and regimental shops, capable of swapping major assemblies like engines, transmissions, and final drives. Fourth echelon, division minus level repair depots with overhead cranes, machine tools, and the ability to perform work that in Germany would require shipping a tank back to the factory. Fifth echelon, rear area rebuild facilities that could take a hull scorched black by fire and return it to service as a functioning tank. And here is the detail that made the whole system possible. The same detail Kummersdorf engineers had noted with disdain in their report on War Daddy 2. Interchangeable parts. A Sherman and destroyed by a Panzerfaust could donate its turret to a Sherman hit in the hull by an anti-Venus tank round. The turret from the first, built by Fisher Body in Michigan, would bolt directly onto the hull of the second, built by Chrysler in Detroit, with no modification, no filing, no fitting, no specialist required. From 2 dead tanks, 1 living tank, ready to fight in 20-40-8 hours. The Germans could not do this, not because they lacked skill. German mechanics were superb, arguably the best trained in the world, but because every German tank was, at some level, unique. A transmission housing from a Panther built at MN in January did not precisely match Benz in March. A final drive from one Tiger might require hours of hand-fitting to work in another Tiger from a different production run, and a Panther part would never, under any circumstances, fit a Panzer IV or a Tiger. 3 completely different vehicles, 3 completely different supply chains. Imagine a German maintenance officer in Normandy in July of 1940-4. He has 14 Panthers in his battalion. 6 are operational. 5 are waiting for final drives that have not arrived from Germany, to need transmissions. Replacing a Panther transmission required removing the entire upper Holland driver's compartment. A job that took a specialized crew with a crane the better part of a day in a rear area safe from air attack. One has an engine fire. He has no spare engines. Now imagine his American counterpart. He has 30 Shermans in his battalion. 20-6 are operational. 2 were knocked out yesterday. 1 is already back. The maintenance section pulled the damaged transmission in 6 hours, bolted in a replacement, and the tank drove back to the line before dawn. By August of 1940-4, 2 months after the invasion, American armored units in France were running at roughly 80-5% operational readiness. 80-5% of their tanks ready to fight at any given moment. But the system behind them was replacing and repairing faster than the Germans could destroy. A Sherman burned out on Tuesday could be a rebuilt Sherman by Friday. A Panther burned out on Tuesday was scrap metal. And the men who suffered most from this arithmetic were not the generals reading reports in Berlin. They were the German anchors sitting in their vehicles, watching the numbers change day by day. Fewer Panthers in the morning assembly. Fewer still by evening. The maintenance tents empty because there was nothing to maintain with. While across the hedgerow, the Americans seemed to have just as many Shermans as yesterday, maybe more. Those tankers were about to get a chance to understand why. Because in the winter of 1940-4, as Germany launched its last great gamble in the West, German crews would climb inside captured Shermans for the first time, not as engineers studying a curiosity, but as soldiers fighting for survival. On the night of January 16, 1940-5, Obersturmführer Erwin Bachmann sat in the sidecar of a motorcycle moving through the Alsatian darkness. He was 20-3 years old, and he had already had more tanks destroyed or abandoned under him than he could count. He was the battalion adjutant of the 1st Battalion, 10th Panzer Regiment, F4 Ansberg Division. He had 4 operational Panther tanks. 4, that was his entire armored force for the night's attack. Operation Nordwind, Germany's last offensive in the West, had been grinding forward for 2 weeks. Fuel was scarce. Replacement vehicles were non-existent. Bachmann's regiment had started the war with over 100 tanks. Now he was planning an assault on an American held village with 4. He did not know what was waiting inside Herlisheim, but a patrol had reported American armor in the streets. Tanks from the 40-3rd Tank Battalion, 12th Armored Division. How many? The patrol could not say. Before dawn on January 17th, Bachmann led 2 of his Panthers into the village from the south. The streets were an arrow, the buildings close. He positioned the 2 tanks at a crossroads and set up Panzerfaust teams in the doorways. Then he waited. The first Shermans came around a corner at close range. The battle erupted in seconds. Bachmann's 2 Panthers destroyed 2 Shermans at close range, but the Americans were not novices. Shermans from the 40-3rd Tank Battalion flanked from the side, one pushing down the eastern street, another from the north. The Panthers were caught in a crossfire. One Panther was hit and caught fire. The crew bailed out. Bachmann ordered the other to fall back. Meanwhile, the Panzerfaust teams moved between buildings approaching another Sherman. They hit it with a Panzerfaust. Then another. The battle raged for hours in darkness and confusion. By dawn, Bachmann's force controlled the village. American prisoners were rounded up, captured soldiers disarmed, and 12 Shermans, 12M for A370-5mm tanks, fully armed, fully fueled, undamaged, were captured intact. Their crews had climbed out with their hands up. The tanks sat in the street with engines idling. What happened next is the moment this story has been building toward. Bachmann's men, Panther crews who had lived inside German steel for years, climbed into the Shermans. They had to fight them immediately, drive them back to the German lines before American artillery found the range. There was no time for manuals, no time for instruction. They sat in the driver's seat, put their hands on the controls, and discovered what the Kummersdorf engineers had written about 2 years earlier. The transmission had synchro mesh on for 5 gears, no double clutching. The stick moved like an automobile gear shift, slot to slot. Smooth, predictable. A Panther's transmission was powerful, but demanded technique. Miss a shift under stress, and you could strip the gears or stall the engine. The Sherman forgave. A 20-year-old who had driven a delivery truck before the war could drive this tank in 10 minutes. Turret traverse, the hydraulic system responded instantly. The gunner found the power traverse precise and swift. Interior heating. The auxiliary generator pumped warm air into the fighting compartment in the dead of winter. German anchors who had been freezing in steel coffins for months were suddenly sitting in a tank with heat. They did not replace the American gun, did not install German weapons, used them exactly as the Americans had built them. 6 days later, on January 20-3rd, 1940-5, the men who ran Germany's entire armored production gathered for a meeting. The Panzer Commission, senior officers, engineers, and industrial representatives responsible for every armored vehicle Germany produced, sat around the table. General Wolfgang Thomel opened with a report from the front. He did not soften it. From the front, there continues to be serious complaints regarding final drive breakdowns in all vehicle types. He read the numbers. 500 defective final drives on the Panzer IV, the workhorse since 1930-9. 300 on the Tiger and Tiger II combined. 1,000 final drives. 1,000 tanks immobilized by a single component. An engineer raised the issue of raw material shortages. Nickel and molybdenum alloy steel had been diverted to submarine production. Substitute alloys worm or brittle, gears shattering under load. Another voice said machining tolerances were too wide. Factories rushing, workers entrained, measuring tools worn or missing. The result was parts that were not interchangeable. Every final drive had to be hand-fitted to its specific tank. Then someone said something that silenced the room. We are not producing tanks as fast as they are breaking down. This was not exaggeration. This was fact. By January 1940-5, the operational readiness of the German armored forces had fallen below 30%. 2 out of every 3 tanks on the battlefield were unable to fight because of mechanical failure, not because they had been destroyed by the enemy, but because they had broken down on their own. Imagine you are a German anchor on the Eastern Front in January 1940-5. You are sitting in a Panther at -20 degrees. The engine is running because otherwise you would freeze to death, but every hour it burns fuel you cannot replace. Your final drive has been making an abnormal sound for 3 days. You know it could shatter at any moment. You reported it up the chain, but there are no replacement parts. You keep moving because the only alternative is to stop and die. Then, at a crossroads, you apply throttle and the tank lurches forward. And then something inside the final drive housing makes a sound like a bag of hammers thrown into a cement mixer. And the tank stops, dead. You and your crew are now sitting in an immobile steel box with Soviet shells falling around you. You do not have the parts to fix it. You do not have a recovery vehicle to tow it. You have 2 choices: stay and die or climb out and run. German anchors were climbing out and running, not from the enemy, from their own machines. Now hold that image and set it beside this one. 6 days earlier, at Herlisheim, Bachmann's men sitting inside 12 captured Shermans. Engines that start, transmissions that shift, final drives that do not shatter, turrets that traverse. A tank that does what you tell it to do, every time, without negotiation. The Panzer Commission knew the numbers. Germany had produced roughly 6,000 Panthers since 1940-3, fewer than 1,400 Tigers of both types combined, about 8,000 Panzer reverses. The Americans, in the same period, had produced over 40 9,000 Shermans from 11 different factories. German engineers were known for precision, and their tanks were known for complexity. But by 1940-5, precision and complexity had become a curse. You cannot manufacture 50,000 of anything with precision. You cannot sustain an army with complex machines in wartime. The things the Kummersdorf engineers had noted with disdain in their 1940-3 report, interchangeable parts, simple design, forgiving manufacture, had been the right answer all along. Build with margin. Build for forgiveness. Build so that a farm boy from Iowa can fix it with a wrench and a manual. Because the alternative is a master machinist who is already dead on the Eastern Front. Somewhere in Alsace, the 13th Company of the 10th SS Panzer Regiment was still fighting in its 12 captured Shermans, and every morning those tanks started. In the last week of April 1940-5, Soviet tanks reached the outskirts of Kummersdorf. The proving ground where Ward Addy had been measured in catalog 2 years earlier was now in the path of the Red Army's final drive toward Berlin. In the chaos, the Germans scraped together Panzer Company Kummersdorf, a museum of desperation. 1 Tiger II, 1 Jag Tiger, several Borgward remote-controlled demolition carriers, an Italian heavy tank, and 2 American Shermans. The same machines that arrived as curiosities were now being sent to defend the proving ground where they had been disassembled. Those Shermans fought Soviet tanks in the suburbs of Berlin, driven by German crews using American ammunition, American hydraulic traverse systems. They fought until they ran out of fuel or were destroyed. By the end of the war, the Germans had captured and used unused approximately 50 to 100 Shermans throughout the conflict. They never replaced the guns, never modified the interior layout, never tried to substitute German systems for American ones. Because there was nothing to fix. What stunned German anchors inside captured American Shermans was not the armor or the gun. It was the ordinary things. A part that fit without filing, a gear that shifted without force, a turret that moved when you told it to. A tank built by locomotive workers and car mechanics 6,000 miles away that worked, simply, reliably, every single time, while their own tanks, built by the finest precision engineers in Europe, fell apart under their hands. That was the verdict, not spoken in a conference room or written in a formal report, but felt in the fingers of a German mechanic who picked up a Sherman road wheel and watched it slide into place without resistance. In the hands of a driver at Hurlesheim who put the Sherman in gear and felt the synchro mesh catch like a Sunday drive. In the silence of a Panther crew sitting in a dead tank in a frozen field, knowing that across the line every American tank was running. The Americans did not build the best tank of the Second World War. They built the best system. And the men inside the captured Shermans were the first to understand what that meant. Not as a statistic, not as a production chart, but as the feeling of a machine that worked. Built by a country that had figured out something Germany never could. How to make 50,000 of anything and make every single one of them right. What stunned them was not any single component that a German engineer could point to and say, "This is better than what we build." It was the ordinary things that no one thought to measure. Things so simple, they seemed beneath the attention of serious engineers. An engine that starts in the cold. A generator that gives you heat when everything outside is frozen solid. These were not luxuries. They were the difference between a crew that could fight and a crew that could barely feel its fingers. But ordinary things win wars. A tank that runs every morning is worth more than a tank that performs brilliantly once and breaks down the next day. Reliability is not glamorous, but it is lethal. The finest precision engineers in Europe had built machines of extraordinary individual capability. But they could not build 50,000 of them. They could not keep them running in the field. They could not fix them when they broke. In the arithmetic of war, reliability multiplies and complexity divides. A tank that breaks down is not a tank at all. It is a liability that consumes resources without returning combat power. The Americans understood something the Germans never grasped, that the best machine is not the one that performs brilliantly on occasion. It is the one that performs adequately every single time, without negotiation, without excuse. Every bolt, every gyroscope, every hydraulic line in the Sherman was identical to the one in the tank next to it. This was not an accident. It was a design philosophy that began not with how to build the best tank, but with how to build 50,000 tanks that all work the same way. The Sherman was not the best tank of the war, but it was the best answer to the only question that mattered. How do you build enough machines, keep them running, and put them where they need to be, month after month, year after year, until the enemy cannot anymore? If you want more deep dives into the machines and systems that shaped the Second World War, smash that like button and subscribe. It helps this channel reach the people who care about understanding history beyond the surface. I am your history observer, and I will see you on the next battlefield. Until then, remember that wars are won not by the finest machines but by the systems that keep them fighting.